So hello everyone. So today is this will be my fifth year presenting ICC, and I thought that that would be a good landmark for me to get as an excuse. And what I actually did is going through. I'm going to recapitulate all the previous ICC I've done in the past, and I will add to it some follow-up in some of those cases. And in in line with this. And in line with this relaxed approach I'm taking today, I want to share with you some of the experience I went when I went to Cuba, my home country, a few weeks ago with my wife and daughter for first time. So we flew from Philadelphia with connection in Fort Lauderdale and then to my hometown in the middle of the country, Santa Clara. So the first case I presented was about a 50-year-old female. She had past medical history of pulmonary embolism and a week of productive cough with white sputum and coin-sized blood clots. Because of the history of PE and the symptomatology, her first exam was a CT pulmonary angiogram, but what they found was this mass here in the distal trachea, and it was not very clear the relation to the esophageal. So they did a double contrast upper GI, which showed a smooth, extrinsically pushing mass, but no direct primary tumor was seen in this study. So the patient went for endobronchial ultrasound guided FNA, and you can see the trachea is obstructed more than 80% from the posterior aspect. The mass is visualized by ultrasound, and it was FNA biopsy, and the stent was left in place. So most of my the specimen I received was in the cell block because of the nature of this being a fragment and a very cohesive. And you can see this beautiful histology, which is made of these monotonous polygonal cells, very well defined cell borders. The cytoplasm is moderate to abundant, amphophilic, very clear to eosinophilic, and the nuclears are round to ovoid with visible nuclei, but no mitosis. The chromatin is very evenly distributed, so in general imparting a very low-grade appearance to this neoplasm. So I started a panel including keratins and neuroendocrine marker for low-grade neuroendocrine neoplasm, also entertained paragangliomas, because of supposed to arrive from the trachea. And the clear cells, we included myoepithelial markers for some salivary gland tumor, and then the clear cell sugar tumor of the lung for the Picoma family with HMB45, also included, even though it looks very benign or low grade, for epithelioid mesothelioma and epithelioid gist, considering that it was there was supposed to be a relation to the esophagus that we were not very clear. All those came back negative, and I felt that a tumor with such a distinct morphology, someone will know, I didn't know at the point, but I felt like I didn't want to keep wasting immuno, so I decided to show in consultation this case. And lucky for me, I showed at the time to Suber, and he immediately, I had to say, he knew, and he pointed out some areas such as the intimate association of the neoplastic cells to the vessels, branches like this, and also areas with this stroma very hyalinized. So we open books and we find out that this tumor is essentially only positive for SMA, which is what is staining here, and vimentin. And I don't know if you guys remember from ICC or already know from this, but this is a glomus tumor. And for those, you know, starting, don't confuse this with the glomus jugular tumor, which essentially is just a misnomer for a paraganglioma from that location. This, we entertain that differential, but those should have been neuroendocrine markers positive and S100 in a sustentacular pattern. So this is a tumor of consider a rare mesenchymal neoplasm, which is made of cells that resemble the modified smooth muscle cell of the normal glomus body. And the glomus body is a small arteriovenous malformation, arteriovenous anastomosis, which are in charge of the controlling the temperature of the skin in the distal extremity. So as such, essentially this tumor is going to be found in the skin and subcutaneous tissue of the hand, and particularly common is the subungual region. Eventually, or sometimes, they can be found in extracutaneous sites, such as our case, and of those, the most common is on the gastric. So since my presentation, the patient went excision of that neoplasm, and even though there was a positive margin, and the patient has had some follow-up, as most of these neoplasms, they have behaved in a very benign fashion, and there hasn't been any recurrence or a metastasis. So, so then we traveled from Santa Clara to the southern coast town of Trinidad, and this is a very old town from the 1500s, founded by the Spaniards, and it's surrounded by a valley with a century-old sugar mills. And what is characteristic of this town is how well it's kept, and typical of all these Spanish town, they have a church and a central plaza. So then I presented a case the following year on what we can see is this bladder washing, which is obviously malignant. A lot of pleomorphism and necrosis in the form of single cell apoptosis, and high NC ratio cells, very hyperchromatic and irregular distributed chromatin, so all features of malignancy, but also notice some cyanophilic cytoplasm, little dense, and some cells with this tail-like. So all these features are compatible with high-grade urothelial carcinoma, and as such, this was I-now. But what is unusual about this case is that this came actually from an 8-year-old boy, and he presented outside in the community with a gross hematuria, and he was referred to CHOP, and they saw an image on the imaging, they saw a bladder mass. The patient did have already a previous history. He was premature, and he had a kidney transplanted for end-stage renal disease with no clear etiology. And of course, then he was immunosuppression. He had developed BK virus nephropathy and received antiviral therapy. And as I said, he presented with this gross painless hematuria. He had a bladder biopsy that showed high-grade papillary urothelial carcinoma. We review here, and then the bladder washing that I just mentioned, we saw. So because this case went to CHOP, but because they don't have a lot of experience with this particular diagnosis, this case was seen in consultation all along with our UU department. And the patient did go or total cystoprostatectomy, bilateral native nephrectomy, margin of the transplanted ureter, and resection of the bilateral lymph nodes, pelvic lymph nodes. So as you can see here, the entire bladder is almost replaced by these coalescent masses, and it is made of this papillary branching and fusing, consistent with high-grade urothelial carcinoma. There were areas such as this with focal lacuna formation with this nest made of a group of cells with the nuclei basally oriented, consisted with micropapillary features. The tumor invading deep into the muscularis propria. There was lymphovascular invasion, I'm not showing here. So what we reviewed the literature, we found indeed that this was very unusual. Urothelial neoplasm in a population less than 20 is something very unusual, and when they present is very low grade neoplasm and with a low stage and very good prognosis, something very different from what we were seeing here. So this is usually just a disease of the very elderly smoker men. Also unique to this case was that the patient had this history of renal transplant. So we found out that renal transplant already have a risk, this patient, of developing urothelial carcinoma at a younger age, and they tend to present with as a high-grade urothelial carcinoma, higher stage, and the explanation for this is thought to be these more potent immunosuppressive drugs, and as well a potential role for oncogenic virus. And of them, As we mentioned, this patient had a BK virus nephropathy, and this is one of the polyoma virus, and we are familiar in cytology with this virus because already creates a lot of confounding factor for us in cytology because the cell changes are very similar to those of urothelial carcinoma. That's why we call them decoy cells. Also in the same family, we already have Merkel cell, which is been implicated in Merkel cell carcinoma. And as such, some small cases, some small case series and case report had documented, like we did on this case, that the Beatles marker surrogate ASB40 was staining only the tumor but not the normal urothelium. However, this by itself does not corroborate that hypothesis that this is related to that. But so in summary, for that, we learned that this is more common. The urothelial neoplasm in young patients are very rare, and when they happen, it's usually a low grade, low stage with good prognosis, and it's not what we saw in our case. And patients who undergo renal transplant, they have an increased risk to develop urothelial cancer, and there is still controversy and studies going on to reveal or not if there is a link between BK and urothelial carcinoma, particularly in this subset of immunocompromised patients. I know about this case. He later developed a pelvic lymph node metastasis, and honestly, I didn't try to find out more for this presentation, in part also because of emotional issue. I didn't want to try to reach to CHOP about it. So then we went to Havana. This is the largest city and the capital of Cuba, and I can tell you it's a beautiful city from the point of view of architecture. You can find almost every style of architecture there, and I'm not a very knowledgeable person, but you can see from neocolonialism to Art Deco buildings there. And this is a good timing because this year Havana is celebrating 500 years since it was founded. So then my last case I'll present, it was of a 52-year-old smoker. He has history of invasive mucinous adenocarcinoma status post right middle lobe lobectomy. He had developed a recurrence of the upper lobe nodule that was treated by stereotactic body radiation therapy. And in his follow-up, he had a PET-CT that was showing some changes in the right upper lobe. It was not clear if this corresponds to radiation changes, but malignancy could not be ruled out, so he underwent a biopsy of this area, and for surprise, we found this pink tissue again on the cell block material, and I'll describe here this abundant cytoplasm, granular eosinophilic with some lipofuscin, very round nuclei with prominent nucleoli and interpes sinusoid. When I'm describing here, it's just normal hepatic tissue. So we did a systematic approach to this, trying to identify if this was a cross-contaminant or a specimen mix-up, and we investigated to the point we did molecular analysis. We ruled out that it was not a mix-up or a cross-contamination, since the DNA analysis showed it did belong to this patient. And so the most logical explanation was that the liver was inadvertently sampled, which is something not uncommon, particularly if they are trying to biopsy the lower lobe of the right lung. But in this case, they were actually going for the upper lobe, which is unusual, and the clinician was like pretty certain that would have been almost impossible. So then, you know, we did research, and we found there were actually some reports of ectopic liver misdiagnosed by radiology as a lung tumor. And then what make it more interesting was that we found that our patient actually was a liver donor years ago, which means that at some point his liver was not intact anymore. There was some injury or some alteration of the normal architecture there, which in a sense could explain. However, I have to tell you that in this preparing for this ICC, I went there and I saw that the patient approximately 8 months later had another FNA from the area, and it did resulted to have a recurrent adenocarcinoma, which entirely doesn't prove that that's not what it was there, but I feel it makes more sense that it was just probably mistaken, inadvertently sampled the liver. So this is me and my family walking on those cobblestone streets from Trinidad. And so I'll take any questions.